Guys, it's Courtney. Today I'm going to be using the Bouquet Builder 3 stamp set by Waffle Flower, and I'm going to be making a 5x7 card because this image is gigantic. So of course I'm bringing out my Misty. I definitely would recommend a stamp positioner for this particular stamp set because the image is so large. I'm going to go ahead and center that onto my card panel here, and this is a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and it is cut down to 5x7. Going to go ahead and stamp that out with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. And of course, we are going to be doing some Copic coloring. And I ended up getting a pretty good impression the first time, but I did stamp this twice because this is the first time I'm using this stamp set. It doesn't always stamp perfectly the first time. And having a stamp positioner, especially for a stamp this large, is definitely helpful. Not necessary, but definitely helpful. So once that was stamped out, we're going to go ahead and move on to the Copic coloring. And this image actually has a ton of detail to it already with the detail of the image itself. So the shading doesn't necessarily need to be perfect. It doesn't even need to, you don't even need to use 4 or 3 colors. You can probably get away with 2 colors because if you do stamp it with black ink, it's going to keep those lines and give you the dimension, even though it's not really there. It gives the illusion that it is. So I'm going to show you some color combinations and how I colored some of these flowers. We'll start off with this larger one here, and I'm going to be using some RV markers. Started off with my lightest color to map out the darkest areas, then going in with my darkest color. My darkest areas will be on the base of that large petal in the center, and then where each one of the petals is kind of lying behind another. Also, that petal off to the left-hand side is kind of folded over on itself, so I'm creating a shadow there. And I'm actually using 5 colors here just because sometimes I have a hard time blending some of the RVs. So I find that if I use more of them and it's more of a gradual transition, then I have better luck. But that's totally up to you whether or not you want to use that many colors. So I'm extending that out each and every time, just leaving a very small highlight on the tip of the petals for that highlight color. And that other flower off to the left-hand side, it's more of a bud. It's not quite as opened, but I colored that the same way with the same color combination. Next, we'll move on to this open flower, and I'm going to be using some V markers. Again, starting off with that lightest color to map out the darkest areas, concentrating the center of the flower being the darkest, and also where each one of those, or some of those petals actually, are hanging over themselves or folded over on themselves, and also where one petal will lay behind another. Now, for the petals that are kind of up front, like this first one, I'm only putting the shading right there in the center, on the base of it, but in the center of the petal, making sure that I don't extend my darkest colors out to the very edge because I don't want 2 of my darkest colors to be touching. The petal next to it is laying behind it, so it's going to have a shadow on it, so I don't want those 2 dark areas to be touching, if that makes any sense. So I'm going in with that darkest color to add in those darkest areas, and then I'll extend that out each time. There's also some little kind of like little notches, they kind of look like, on the tips of just a few of the petals, and I'm adding some shading to those as well. And I'm just putting one little flick line with the darkest color, and then I'll extend that out each and every time. You just want to make sure that if you're going to be adding some texture to anything, you want to make sure that you're extending it out, or when you're doing your shading, you're extending it out in the same direction each and every time. It usually doesn't matter which direction you choose, just as long as you go in the same direction each and every time, it will give a little bit of texture to those petals. Now for that one petal that's really has a big fold on it on the top, I am adding a little bit of shading to that fold itself. But most of the time when they are folded over, I just reserve my lightest color or maybe my 2 lightest colors for that area to kind of differentiate between that part of the petal and the main part of the petal. I hope that makes sense to you guys. So I'm on my lightest mid-tone here, and then I'm going to go in with my lightest color again to blend all of those colors out. And for the center of the flower, there's not a whole lot of area to work with here, so I'm not going to do any shading. I'm just going to grab a Y marker, and quite honestly, when I have such a small area like this, I just grab one. It doesn't matter which color it is, just to add a little bit of color to the inside of that flower. Next, moving on to these open flowers next to it, I started by coloring these with my RV21 markers, and I'm coloring this the same way as I did for the other, just concentrating that darkest area being in the center and where one petal is laying behind another, and blending that out each time. Also, there would be a small shadow where this flower is behind another, but I don't go in with my darkest color. I'll go in with my darkest midtone for that, just because I don't want that shadow to be too overwhelming. In the end, well, you'll see me fix this in a little while, but once I continued on with my coloring, I just wasn't happy with the colors of these flowers. They were a little bit too bright, I guess. I love the RV21-20 combination. I think it's probably my new favorite, but it was just a little bit too bright for this card. So we'll go in and fix that afterwards, and we'll show you how I fix that, just to kind of tone it down a little bit. So I colored the other flowers next to that the same way with that same color combination. And next we'll move on to these smaller flowers on the top. And I know all of these flowers have real names to them. And I love coloring flowers. I think it's my favorite thing to color, but I know really nothing about flowers. So I don't know what these are called, but I'm going to be using my RV80 markers for these as well. And these are a lot smaller than the others, so you could get away with using less colors. But I wanted to make sure that I kept that contrast by using that R89, which is significantly darker than the rest of them. And I'm just adding a little bit of shading on the base of each of the petals and where one petal lies behind another. And then blending that out with the R85, R83, and R81. There are some of these flowers that are more open than these ones on top, but I colored them pretty much the same way as I colored the other flowers that were open as far as the shading goes. Obviously just a different color combination, and did add a little bit of that yellow in the center of those open flowers. So here's where I noticed that those ones that we colored with the R20s were so bright. So I'm going to go in with my RV63, and I'm just going to cover up the entire thing. Because Copics are transparent, my RV20s are going to kind of show through, but this is just going to tone it down a little bit. And I've already done the shading with the RV20s, so I don't have to worry about doing any additional shading. I'm just going over them solid. So because I have that RV63 out, I'm going to go ahead and continue with the RV60s to color in these last couple of flowers here. And again, not sure the name of them, but I'm only using a 3-color combination for these because they are so small. But again, as always, starting off with that lightest color and just adding a little bit of shading in what would be the base of the petal, even though these are kind of upside down. And then just extending that out with the RV66 and just leaving a very small highlight on the very tip of each of the petals for that RV63. So once all of my flowers were colored, we'll move on to the leaves, and these actually have more shape to them. So for this large leaf right here in the center, I'm going to be using some G markers naturally, and I'm going to go in with my lightest color to get that paper saturated. And this leaf is kind of, each side of it or each half of it is kind of bowed out. So you're going to have some shading in the center as well as the edges. So I'm going to go in with my darkest color here, and I'm just drawing a straight line down the center to kind of help me, kind of guide me. And then I'm creating small little flicks. Oh, that's Macy. That's not Frankie this time. That's Macy. She wanted to be in the video. You very rarely will see her. But I'm going in the direction of the flicks or those lines that are within the image. So they're kind of curved a little bit, so my flicks are going to be curved as well. So I'm flicking from the inside out on either side of the leaf, and then from the edge of the leaf I'm flicking towards the inside, again kind of curved out a little bit. Next, going in with the the G46, and I'm just extending those flicks out a little bit further, but again, making sure they are kind of curved. And you can see that I turn my paper a real lot when I color because I find that it's easier for me to flick away from myself, but some people can flick both ways and get the same result. I usually can't. So I turn my paper a lot. G24 doing the same thing, extending those flicks out even further, and I'm just leaving a highlight in the center of each half of the leaf. It's kind of weird, but once you see it all colored, you can kind of see the shape of the leaf. And the other two full leaves I colored the same way with those same colors. And for these leaves that are kind of, you can only see half of it, I'm assuming these are kind of folded in half. I'm skipping the G46 on this because these are smaller areas, but I'm using the G28, G24, and G21, and I'm just putting a little bit of shading on the bottom part of the leaf, and it would actually be the center of the leaf, but the bottom portion of what we can see. And I did that for both of them that are shaped like this. So next I'm going to go in with these little teeny tiny leaves over here, and I'm just using two colors. First going in with the YG97, which is my darkest color. This time, because they're so tiny, I don't want to risk having my colors bleed, so I'm going right in with that darkest color and then extending that out with the YG93. Typically I'd go to the YG95, but I skipped that being I'm only using two colors. I wanted to make sure that I had some contrast, so I skipped the YG95 just so that those two colors were a little bit further away from one another. So once that was done, I'm going to move on to the G09, and I'm just using the very tip of my marker to fill in the stems, or at least some of the stems. And you can see once I get towards the bottom, I kind of lose track of what stem belongs with what. Some of the stems are already solid, so no coloring is needed, and other ones are open where you can color them in, and you can see that I kind of lost track of what was what. But my rule is that if I can't tell what something is, neither can the recipient. So I'm not going to stress over it. I'm just going to kind of continue on. I did add just a little bit of shading to that one stem that is coming off of that one open leaf, just so that the G09 and the G28 aren't too far away from one another. So I added just a little bit of the G28 where that stem meets that leaf, and then blended that in with the G09. Not that it was all that noticeable, but I wanted to have more of a smoother blend. Now for the base of the flowers, I'm not sure what the term for this is, but where the leaves or the stem would normally meet the flowers, I am going to do just a little bit of shading, as well as these little tiny leaves that are kind of sticking out some of those smaller areas. And I'm only using three colors here. I'm using the G28 as my darkest color, going right in with the darkest color because they are such a tiny area. And then going in with the G09, and then just for my highlight, I'll be using the G03. I'm using that pretty sparingly because this is more of a brighter green. So once my coloring was complete, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go over pretty much the entire thing with a BG, what did I use? A BG 10. And I just refilled my marker, and apparently I overfilled it. And you can see that I have a blob there, but luckily it didn't go over my image. So I'm just going to work on the other side first and let this kind of dry a little bit. So if I go over it now, the paper is so completely saturated that I don't want this color to bleed anymore, and I don't want to kind of rip or fray my paper. So I'm just carefully using the very tip of my marker to go around my images. You can certainly do this first, which I probably should have. If you touch, the BG10 is so super light. So if I touch any of those pink or purple flowers, I run the risk of dragging that color out, which you can see in the end, I did. But most of this is going to be cut off, so I'm not really too concerned about it. I'm just finishing up and getting to that blob, which is now dried. And in the end, once I go over or around it, you can't even tell that it's there. So I'll be honest with you, I somehow lost the rest of the footage of this card. And I didn't realize it till the very end. So off camera, I restamped and recolored this entire thing. Now, this is a little bit different of a panel, but you can see that it's pretty much the same. I believe I use the same color combinations. So in order to cut down my panel, I wanted some of this bouquet to kind of stick out. So I'm using my T-square ruler and a pencil, and I'm just kind of centering my lines as a guide to where I want to make my cuts. And you can see that I'm stopping my pencil line right before and right after where my image kind of sticks out of those lines. And this part will be fussy cut out because I want this to kind of hang over. So it's kind of like partial die cutting, but I'm not die cutting, if that makes sense. So next I'm using a craft knife here, and I couldn't find my finger one by Fiskars. I just recently moved, so a lot of things either were never found or haven't been found yet. So I'm just going along those pencil lines, and then I'll cut away those pencil or where I cut with that craft knife, and then fussy cut the rest of the image, leaving a border to make it match the rest of that line that we had cut. Again, just lining up my T-square ruler to use with my craft knife, stopping just short of the image, and then starting directly after the image, cutting away those little strips, and then fussy cutting that little stem that's kind of hanging out there. And I did this with all four sides the same way, with just a little bit of my flower, a little bit of my image kind of hanging off the side. I think this just gives it a little bit of interest rather than just stamping and coloring like I do many times. So once that was all complete and all my fussy cutting was done, I'm going to take a 5x7 card here, and this is already scored, and I want to pop up my panel. First, I fixed up any coloring that I didn't quite bring that BG10 out enough. So I fixed up those areas, and then I'm going to take some foam tape, and I'm covering up the entire back, including the little itty bitty tiny pieces that are hanging off as far as that stem goes, because I don't want this to get stuck in an envelope, either when I'm putting it in the envelope or the recipient is taking it out of the envelope. Remove the backing of my foam tape, adhered that down to my card base, and realized this was a little crooked. I don't even know if you guys can notice it on camera, but as I'm looking at it, I can notice it more and more. So what I ended up doing is I ended up trimming off the back portion of that card, and then I'll just fix up all four sides. So I'm not doing really any measuring here. I'm just kind of freehanding it to make sure that it looks or appears to be a little bit more centered than it was before. And I'm just using, once you get one side done, it's a lot easier to line up in your paper trimmer to make sure that it is all straight and centered. So next we'll move on to the sentiment. I'm taking a scrap piece of black cardstock here, treating that with my anti-static tool, and I'll stamp each one of my happy and my birthday words with Versamark ink, then sprinkle on some Hero Arts white embossing powder. I'll go ahead and heat set that, and then I cut this down into skinny little strips. And I wasn't sure where I wanted to place my sentiment, but I know that I had some of that pink or purple that had kind of bled out. Not really bled out, but I kind of dragged out the color with that BG10. So I knew I needed to cover up that area. So I wanted my sentiment strips to kind of hang off my main panel there. So I'm taking two little tiny pieces of the Scotch foam tape, and I'm going to place that down at the part or at the beginning of each of the words where it's hanging off my main panel to kind of make it flush or the same height as the rest of my panel, using my Tombow Mono multi-glue to the rest of that strip that's going to lay flat on my main panel. And this covered up that little smear that I had there, which I don't even know whether you guys can see, but it was very, very noticeable in real life. So once my sentiment was down, I'm going to take another 5x7 card here, use my bone folder to crease that, and then I'll use my same Tombow Mono multi-glue to adhere this panel flat down to my card base. And last, I do have a little bit of a border here, but I'm okay with that as long as my main panel is actually centered. So last, I'm going to use a few of the Stardust enamel dots, and these are also by Waffle Flower. And I do use a little tiny bit of my glue, and you can use any glue here, just to make sure that these don't shift around in the mail. And I use my scissors just to kind of pick those up and place those down on my card. And I took my Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen to add some sparkle to most of the flowers, because that's what I do. But that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.